Now that we've learned about equilibrium, what we need to do is to use some of that knowledge to enhance our story, because we have to remember, so far our story of equilibrium was based in the milk market in our situation, but in whichever market, where we are looking at situations where the ceteris is paribus, where we are saying the only thing that's changing is in this market is this is my supply, this is my demand, ceteris paribus, and I let loose the agents, the consumers and producers, their interactions work out, and we end up in equilibrium, right? But since we know the ceteris is not paribus, our next question is going to be, well, what happens if something changes in the market? And in this case, we're talking about changes in conditions other than the price of milk. So the first thing to remember is that because our agents don't interact with each other except through prices, right? When we come across a change, the very first question we're going to ask is, which side of the market is this going to affect, right? So certain kinds of things will affect the demand side of the market. This is the kinds of things that affect the behavior of consumers. And we already talked about that, right? Prices of complements, prices of substitutes, income, tastes, expectations, these can affect the behavior of consumers. Similarly, we know that there are certain things that can affect the behavior of suppliers, but let's focus on the consumers for now, all right? So something happens which is going to affect the consumption side of the market. And then I'm going to ask, what is the effect of that going to be? So to tell this story, there are a few assumptions I'm making, and if these assumptions turn out not to work well, then it will turn out that I'll have to modify the story. So again, a reminder, this is just your basic story. It's going to be a story that we end up adapting, questioning, changing as we go on. But let's say that income went up, people became richer, and as they became richer, they decided, oh, I can buy more fresh milk on a regular basis, right? So in that case, the impact is on the side of demand, and we know that this is going to show up as an outward shift in demand. I'm going to call that D1, all right? And now the story is really important. I'm going to say, let us say that we began here at equilibrium, which for us, if you remember, the equilibrium price was 2, the equilibrium quantity was 5, right? Because of a change in income levels and milk being a normal good, people decided to buy more milk. So demand shifted out. The moment this happened, I now have to figure out what the story is. I'm no longer in equilibrium. Because now, when demand shifted out at a price of 2, suppliers are still supplying 5, right? But consumers now actually want to buy more than 5. Let's say that because of this shift, they now want to buy 9, right? So what that does is suddenly an excess demand opens up and there is a shortage. And now we know what happens when there is a shortage. When there is a shortage, price competition opens up where suppliers realize because of the shortage, they can start nudging up prices. As they start increasing the prices, quantity supplied goes up along the old supply curve because nothing has changed in the old supply curve. Quantity demanded starts to reduce along the new demand curve, which is where people are right now. And it goes, so first there's a shortage that opens up, and then prices go up, and then the shortage starts getting eliminated because quantity demanded starts reducing. It doesn't reduce all the way back to the original 5, but it's not going to be at 9 until you reach a new equilibrium, in this case at $3. And a quantity of 8, right? And in this case, when demand increases, the new equilibrium will show you a higher price and a higher quantity compared to the old equilibrium. And this is what people mean when they say when demand goes up, price goes up, quantity goes up. That's really all they mean, right? In the same way that I looked at the effect of changes in ceteris paribus conditions on the consumer side, I can look at that changes on the supply side. So this is dollars per gallon, price of milk, quantity in gallons, and I can start here. The price was $2 and the quantity was 5, right? And now something happens, and in this case what happens is something that affects the supply side, right? The producer's decisions. So in this case, we're going to focus on something that affects supply decisions. Let us say that input costs went up, that usually you give your cows these cow feed pellets, the cost of these pellets have gone up, it's becoming more expensive to feed your cows, all right? So if your costs go up, then at each price you will sell less than before. And this is the moment when we have to remember that the axes are flipped. A decrease in supply is a leftward or inward shift of the supply curve. So here, S1 is my new supply curve. Okay? And when supply decreases, the whole curve shifts inward. And I can compare what happens by looking at this process in terms of what is the effect of a change in input costs, of an increase in the cost of feed for cattle on this market for milk. And the answer is, well, at the old price of 2, we were initially in equilibrium where quantity supplied and quantity demanded matched each other at 5. But now we're in a situation where supply has decreased. So even though quantity demanded stays at 5, quantity supplied just shrunk, let's say to 1. Suddenly in this market, a shortage has opened up. Consumers are still demanding 5. Producers are only supplying 1. And now we know what happens. There is a shortage. This shortage causes price competition. Suppliers start nudging their prices up. Remember, they're not saying, oh, input costs are gone up, that's why I'm increasing my prices, right? They're able to do this only because there is a shortage. So this is why you have to run this through the story, right? Because sometimes you will see situations where changes in costs have minimal effects, and that has a lot to do with whether or not there is a sort of capacity, a shortage that's emerging, and producers have the capacity to raise prices. So over here, we're seeing a shortage opens up. Producers start raising the prices in the market mechanism. As prices go up, we come to a new equilibrium, because with the increase in prices, producers now start, quantity supplied along the new supply curve starts to go up. Quantity demanded starts shrinking along the old curve, and let's say this is $3 and 4, something like that, right? So what you're beginning to see is that the market mechanism shows us that if there is a decrease in supply, then curve shifts, shortage occurs, you end up with a set of changes which will bring you to a new equilibrium price which is higher and a new equilibrium quantity which is lower, right? So just as I saw this for supply decreasing, I can similarly say what will happen if there was a technological change that made it cheaper to produce milk and there was an increase in the quantity supplied, and I can tell this story in terms of an outward or leftward shift of the supply curve. So overall, because I'm doing this one step at a time, there's really only 4 situations you're going to see, or scenarios you're going to see, in terms of exams and in terms of practice, right? I'm going to give you an example, and you're going to look at that example, and you're going to first decide which side is it affecting, demand side or supply side, right? Then you're going to say, oh, and depending on which side it's affecting, you're then going to say, oh, is this going to result in demand going up or down? Is this going to result in supply going up or down? So that's 4 four cases, right? Demand up, demand down, supply up, supply down. In the real world, of course, it's never so neat. Things can change at the same time, right? Sometimes there are things that affect both sides. So we have to think a little bit more in terms of how we depict that and what the final outcomes will be. Right? So when both curves are shifting, we actually need more information about who is responding more, who is not responding as much. That's when we start using ideas of elasticity and volume of shifts to think about what's going on. But for now, this is enough. So this completes our first foray into markets. We'll be having an exam on what we've done so far. And after that, after your exam, when you come back, we're going to do a deeper dive. We're going to delve more deeply into the demand side through our theory of the consumer. And then we're going to delve more deeply into the supply side through our theory of the firm. Right? And then after we learn that, we're going to come back to these markets and start modifying it and saying, how can we complicate this story? So that is where we are. I will see you after the exam.